You're listening to the Autism Weekly podcast. Each week, we share community voices and bring light to stories that increase awareness, acceptance, equity, access, and inclusion. If you haven't already, subscribe to join the Autism Weekly family. I'm your host, Jeff Skibitsky. This week, we'd like to welcome Jessica Wilbur, a mother of 2 children with ASD, autistic disorder, and a behavior technician recruiter for ABS Kids. Her sons, Chris and Alex, are now 10 and 6 years old. Jessica navigated the diagnosis of her boys, retiring from the Air Force and relocating from Louisiana and Michigan, all while researching the best supports for her family, such as therapies, interventions, her community, the school. Now, also working as behavior technician recruiter for ABS Kids, Jessica brings a unique view of the autism community through her experiences. We're excited to talk about what she's learned along the way and ongoing challenges, especially how the wide support options out there for families can intersect, collaborate, and even possibly compete at times. Jessica, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Well, we're excited, and your perspective is so unique, is the fact that you went from a parent who's trying to figure out everything that's going to be best for her children to somebody who now has a chance to walk not just families through the process, but to evolve passion and help people to kind of see the value of being a contributor to the community in some way. But before we go there, tell me a little bit about yourself, your sons, and before you give me that detail, thank you for your service. Is that any time we have somebody who's come in and put in that time with the military, I do want to give you that big thank you from us. But tell me about the diagnostic process, because your sons are so different.
Absolutely. They absolutely are. And we went through that process in 2 different states, through 2 different organizations. And so it was a little bit different. Starting out with Chris, I was in an interesting situation where I had 3 of my friends that were all pregnant at the same time that I was. So going through those developmental stages, I had 3 different perspectives of people posting things on Facebook and doing things like that were saying, oh, today my son or daughter did this or did that. And so that was kind of my initial, I guess, looking at it as, oh, Chris isn't doing that yet. Or, just kind of seeing that things were a little different. And then obviously through our pediatric appointments, not hitting milestones and doing things like that, we started to recognize that there were differences. So, that started out with just doing some speech therapy because he wasn't progressing, as fast as they would expect as far as the speech aspects, and then ultimately being that autism diagnosis, which, to be perfectly honest, I didn't know anything about it. I have heard, of this, the disorder before, but never really knew a lot or understood, what that meant until I was going through it personally. So, the process for Chris was really just a fairly simple appointment with a psychiatrist that, they go through those steps of, let's see how we get reactions on this or that, or, all of those things. So that was a fairly simple appointment, and it was very positive, surprisingly enough, just because the individual that did that diagnosis was very positive about it and talking about the patients that she had diagnosed in the past and seeing how much progression they have over the years and things like that. So she was, very positive about, this is not, it doesn't have to be negative. We can look at this at a positive light and still see growth and things. When Alex was diagnosed, after I retired, and so Alex's diagnosis was in Michigan. obviously at this point we're a little more experienced. Chris is 4, so we've seen a lot of those things. We had been through ABA therapy and those things, so it was a little easier to recognize what similarities they had through that development process. So he also started out with speech therapy, and then we went through that diagnosis. For him, it was a little more intense only because there were multiple people they went through. It was longer. The process of actually sitting and going through all the testing was longer than it previously was. And I didn't feel the same positivity necessarily from that as I did with the original diagnosis, but we kind of, had a lot more information and were, I guess, a little bit more prepared for that with him.
Yeah, so the path that you went through,
Hmm.
it's interesting. We're actually having a lot of these conversations right now within our teams. Is the parents are really integral in identifying a lot of this right now, as much as pediatricians are prepared and they're
Sure.
running screeners, is that parents are the ones asking the questions. They're the ones that are kind of giving any of that feedback to their pediatrician. Um, what were the signs? I mean, I know that you're saying, I got my friends here. We're talking about this. We're seeing these developmental gaps. But what were the signs that you identified? If you were to tell parents, first of all, it doesn't need to be that scary, is that there's so
Sure.
many very wonderful things about raising a child who's autistic.
Hmm.
But that being said, there are challenges. But what were the pieces that you picked out first that you said, I'm going to talk to my pediatrician because something's up?
Sure. For Chris specifically, it was not having those initial words. There were no, even on a minimum scale, there were no mamas, dadas, things like that. He and still to this day, he still does a lot of humming and different sounds like that, but not so much words. He also was not making eye contact. That was a big thing. There wasn't a lot of connection with others. I always tell people the easiest way for me to explain it is that Chris saw people as other objects in the room. So there wasn't a difference between, a person being in the room and any other object in the room. He was very independent. He played independently. So, he like I said, he didn't make eye contact. There was a lot of spinning toys and things, not necessarily using them for what we would call appropriately. So not using them in the way that most children do, driving cars around versus lining cars up or categorizing them in some way. So there was a lot of that kind of drew our attention to it being a little bit different.
Well, thank you for sharing that, because a lot of times is that it's the stereotypical pieces that you'd be looking at.
Sure.
It's like, well, if your child's not making eye contact, what that means is hard. I mean, it's, as a
Sure.
parent, it's like, well, are they making eye contact with me, or are they not? But it's looking at those other components of, I'm not even concerned necessarily that my child is autistic, but these are talking points.
Hmm.
Bring those talking points. Dialogue helps everything, and say, I don't feel like there's a social connection. Is there anything I need to be worried about? These are the things I'm seeing instead. And the way that you had phrased it there probably opened up a world of conversation with the pediatrician, it's an important first step.
Sure.
But you mentioned two different experiences. You
Hmm.
mentioned the one that was super positive. You had a very good relationship with the pediatrician. They made you feel at ease, and to know that, things might change, but they're not all for the worse. Like, some of them might be for the better. Who knows? But we're going to work through this together, and there's hope for the parent to say, this isn't a sentence to me having a bad life going forward, or my child have a bad life going forward. It means it might be a different experience than others might have. What was the key factor between the differences between the diagnoses? One of them sounded like it was very prolonged. It looked like it might have even taken longer to even get to, which is
Mhm.
access to care issues, which we have to tackle with. But others was the bedside manner.
Sure.
What would you give to the psychologist or the feedback that you'd say for a family coming in and being prepared for that process?
It's hard. I mean, to be perfectly honest with you, I I would say I was in denial initially with Chris because being a new mom and not having any of these experiences before, I actually fought back a lot with the pediatrician, the things that they were saying because, you have to fill out this uh list of questions that's how many ever pages long, 10 questions long of do they do this? Do they do this? And it's sometimes, always, never, going through all of that. And so you fill all that out and then you go into your appointment and it's 10 minutes or whatever and the pediatrician is trying to get your child to do those things in that short amount of time. And so I would get frustrated because she would say, "Oh, didn't do this, didn't do this, didn't do this." And I'm thinking, you're giving him 5 seconds to do that activity. But I'm telling you, it does happen sometimes. He does do this. And so I pushed back a lot on it because it's just you don't know how to navigate that when you're a new parent and you have so many anxieties about everything with your child and making sure that they're okay. And so I think most people are going to have that little piece in their head that says, no, there's nothing wrong with my child is perfect. And so it took me time to realize that this diagnosis still doesn't mean there's anything wrong with my child. It's just different. And there are different things that you have to navigate. So, I did push back on that a little bit as initially, but I definitely would say a lot of parents are going to be going through that experience of the unknown, not knowing. I love that 10 years later now I can look at it and see that there is so much more awareness in our world of autism than when Chris got that initial diagnosis. So I do love that, and I love that people are talking about it, be it clinicians or in the school system or parents or autistic individuals themselves. Like, there's so much more awareness about it, so that's helpful. But I think as a psychiatrist or anyone else that's diagnosing, I think it's just important to keep that in mind, that parents may not understand. And even more so than me, I have seen other parents that push it away even more and say, no, I don't care what your diagnosis says, that there's nothing that does not pertain to my child. And so just being able to, like you said, have that bedside manner to just say, okay, let's just talk through this. Because I had to get to a point where I realized that if I was fighting against it and not getting my kids what the help that they needed, the only people that were hurt by that were them.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's this weird intersection between awareness, acceptance, celebration that exists. I mean, when you're raising a child, and it exists also when you're raising a child who's autistic. It's like,
Sure.
how am I aware of everything my child's capable of doing? Where am I accepting that, some of these things are not in their repertoire? And
Right.
how do I help them to celebrate who they are? And as a family, do that. But it becomes harder when you're talking about, okay, so now I have school, now I have intervention, now I have family members, and now I have other stakeholders that are in my child's life. So, as a parent, how do you juggle all of these competing needs and still have a semblance of life? I mean, it feels like you're constantly having to inform, advocate, be a voice. How does that work out from the family perspective?
I think part of it just is blocking out the negative. I think that that's the first step that you just have to do, to be able to keep kind of your sanity. But you know, again, the other piece of that too, while I got to a place of acceptance within myself, I wasn't really sharing it with a lot of people. Obviously close family, close friends knew about what was going on, but I was not sharing it with the world. And then one day I just kind of woke up and I thought, if I'm what am I doing? Like, why am I choosing to do this? Part of it was a place of protection because I I felt like I was protecting specifically Chris at that point by saying, no, I'm not going to tell anybody that there's anything going on because people will judge him or people will not understand or, whatever that looks like. Um, but then I thought, as much as I'm not sharing what all these challenges are, I'm also not sharing those celebrations. And every time we would have, a moment where something would happen and I was excited about it, I wasn't sharing that either because nobody knew and no one would understand. For me to jump in and say, "Oh, my 5-year-old completed a full sentence," would not be understood by the general public because would have to be that full conversation. And so I did just wake up one day and said, I'm not going to do this anymore. And so I put a post out there on Facebook for family and friends in the world to see and said, this is Chris. This is where he is. These are the struggles we have. These are the amazing things that he has been able to accomplish and where that has gone. And I was so surprised not only by the support that I got from my family and friends, but also what I didn't expect was to have so many people come back to me and say, we're going through the same thing. Or my child is 2, 3 years old, and these are the things that I'm seeing. How did you know? And
Mm-hmm.
so being able to now go to a place where I'm able to help other people just simply by telling my story and telling Chris's story, I was kicking myself for not doing it earlier. So
Well, don't kick yourself on. I mean, courage comes at different times, and quite frankly, it's when we're all trying to understand our own emotions around something, it's so hard to put that out there for others to absorb and to face any potential backlash. And that's the society we're in, is
right,
that you might get some positive feedback at times. But accompanied with that, you've got to know that there's going to be people who are going to say things that you just don't want to hear. And that could be
mhm,
family members. It could be your teachers. It could be somebody in the community as you're trying to integrate and just live the life that you want to live with your family. So when you went through this process, part of that integration and trust and vulnerability is being able to say, okay, well, I need the right community around me.
sure.
How did you go from you finally put it out there, you're celebrating with your family, you've accepted some things that you guys are going to have to modify as a family to be able to work through challenges, but now I need to find the right groups to help me on this journey. How did you start that process?
So, it's a hard question to answer just because I think there are still things that I need to do, and ways that I need to do that. I feel like overall I've kind of been lucky to be in a community and in an area where a lot of those things are already present. So little things like our mall did a sensory friendly Santa meeting. So you could actually set up an appointment where they keep the lights down and the music is off and they schedule them during times that the mall's not actually open. So there are no people in there. And so just having those sensory friendly events that, you can go in and you can do those things and it's a little easier for your kids to navigate, are extremely helpful. I think, I got a lot of recommendations as far as like support groups and things like that when Chris was initially diagnosed. And for the same, I guess, kind of for the same reasons that I didn't say things on Facebook, I didn't do those things, which I fully recommend for any parents out there that you do, because within the last year, one of Chris's classmates, her mother reached out to me and said, they're really getting along in school and we'd like to do some things outside of school. And so over the last year, we've done a lot of things together. And so we, the kids get along, and then, she and I connect and are able to talk about things, and what are you seeing, or what challenges do you go through, and just having somebody that understands that you don't have to do a full explanation of everything. I can say something as small as, well, Chris was up until 3 a.m, and she's like, oh yeah, got it. So just little things like that where you have somebody that understands you and understands what you go through.
Yeah, those personal connections you can't replace. I
Sure.
do love the fact that you had a community that tried to be able to create more inclusive opportunities, that didn't say that, hey, you can't be a part of this, but instead figured out, how do I make sure that you can be a part of it? And I've seen that with airlines, where they'll say, hey, you know what, let's do this. Let's get everybody out there who hasn't experienced this before and needs extra support. Let's give them a chance to walk through, see an airplane, do all that. I've seen it with restaurants where they say, you know what, we are going to create the environment so that everybody has a chance to be able to eat at our restaurant, enjoy our food, enjoy our ambiance, or whatever it may be.
Sure.
It does take that community relationship. On that same note, when we're talking about community, there's a passion, there's a drive, there's compassion, empathy that exists out there in so many people. And right now, you're taking your experience as a parent who is such a strong advocate for your own children, and you're trying to expand that. You're trying to say, I need talented people around me all the time. What is it that you're looking for when you're saying, you know what, we need more people to be passionate about my kids, about kids like my kids, and that can really help them be their best selves?
Sure. It's first of all, it's really hard to, and I actually choose not, I guess, to disconnect those two pieces when I'm talking to somebody. So, in an interview, I always have that piece in the back of my mind that says, is this the kind of person that I would want working with my child? Is this, and I've experienced a pretty wide gambit through school systems, through ABA therapy, through providers, through the general public, which is a little bit different. But obviously, I have experienced the wide gambit of people that maybe are not in the right field, and people that are just amazing and can draw things out of your kids that you didn't even know were there. So I definitely feel like I've seen all of that from the personal side. So when looking at behavior technicians, the big thing is just having that passion. I feel like there are so many jobs in this world that you can just teach somebody how to do it and they're going to be great. I don't think this is one of those. You have to have a certain level of just desire to work with children, and compassion, and certain things that that just can't be taught. But at the same time, it's not just like, your typical daycare type situation. There are a lot of challenges with it. So you have to be able um to be strong in that, where you still have that piece of compassion, and you're able to say, okay, if you need to just slow down and take a break, then that's okay. But that's not going to stop us from completing this task. Like, you're still going to have to be able to do it. So being able to have that compassion combined with a strength of saying, you still have to do these things, I think is very important for sure.
Yeah, and the whole field is learning this over time. It was a science-based field, still is, but now it's a practitioner science-based field. We need that empathy. We need that compassion to be able to really understand, how am I going to help this person to achieve their goals, not my goal. How am I going to help them to achieve their goals? And it's a position where the behavior technician, the one that you're recruiting for, it might be one of the hardest jobs anybody's going to be walking into. But I will also say it's probably one of the most rewarding when you take a step back and you're able to enjoy the celebration that we talked about earlier, and do that with the family, do that with the school, do that with everybody, is that you can't forget that part of the job as you're working through it, because it's so empowering. Intrinsically, there's not a better feeling than to know that I help somebody today.
Sure.
So what is it that we're running into? Because I'll be honest, is that as an industry, it's a very, very tough position. It's entry level. Oftentimes, and there are career paths. There are ways to go on it. But in order to get to the career paths, you're doing some very tough work on a regular basis. What is it that needs to be highlighted to be able to make sure that those people who really have that passion don't burn out? Those people who really care about what they're doing and really want to be a part of something bigger than themselves have a role to be able to play and feel like they're valued. What is it that needs to be bridged there?
Well, I think to a certain extent, it's really just about checking in and saying, how are you? Your BCBAs and those supervisory positions, just keeping a close eye on their behavior technicians and, obviously RBTs as well. But just watching that and saying, do you have everything that you need? Are you struggling? And giving them a platform to be able to express that honesty and say, it's too much this week, or it's, what I mean, to be able to talk through those things. I think is very important. And, we also, I have found a lot lately that a fairly significant amount of the people that I interview have autism in their family somewhere, whether it be their children or nieces and nephews or cousins. Or so I think that awareness of autism and what ABA therapy is definitely bringing more people in. And I think it's important that we're just continually out there and talking about it, because I think as more people become aware that this exists, the more we're going to have joining the field.
Yeah, and when you stop and think about it, is that you're talking about, checking in with their managers, their clinicians, BCBS. But I don't want to downplay how much of a leadership role and how many leadership skills a behavior technician is demonstrating, learning, developing in their role, because they are leading a child in the child recognizing their strengths. They're leading on how to be able to really empower somebody, see those gaps, see those areas where the child excels, and pull them out of that person. That's what leaders do. They empower those that they're working with. So
Sure.
I think that some of these things that are intrinsic to great career paths, good opportunities, are established at that behavior technician role. And it is a good place to start. And if you can find that difference, I think it's so important. And as a family member who received care, you want to know that those things exist and that those right people are hired, because you don't want to have to do that yourself. You want for the organization to be able to support their own teams that way. So as you've kind of gone through this process, and it's been a journey, I would imagine. You've had two different sons that experienced autism very differently, of course, like most people do. Their trajectories and paths very different. And if I'm correct, intensive therapy isn't a part of their everyday treatment right now, is that
That's
they've
correct. Mhm.
integrated, they've recognized areas probably where, there's gaps here, but strengths here. And, I'm navigating life on my own right now, and there's little nuances. What do you tell the family that is going through the process, and you're
Mhm.
you're not necessarily at the tail end? Who knows what a tail end of this process is, but you're at a place where you have independent children. What do you tell them about, the patience that it might take, the dedication that it took to get to where you are, because it's not an overnight success, like with any child rearing system.
It's definitely endless. It's an endless need for patience and dedication and everything else. And and it's trial and error. It's okay to, realize that something is not working the way that you need it to work. And I think the important thing is to make sure that you use your voice where your kids don't have one, because that has been the biggest piece. And we did that from the very beginning, because even, back before Chris had his diagnosis, when we started speech therapy at 2 years old with him, through the state program, the Early Start program, the very first person that we worked with, she was great. She had a supervisor that just, when she came into our home and the way that she handled things and the way that she spoke to and about my child, we were not comfortable with. And so we went back to them and said, this isn't going to work for us. And so they made the change. They sent us a new speech therapist, and she was amazing. She's still my Facebook friend. She still checks in on Chris. And, so she was there for some of his very first celebrations, for sure. She was there the first time he said a word. So, but I think that is definitely important to know when something isn't working right or someone is not the best fit. And it's not necessarily about the person either. You can have a therapist that's great personally, but just doesn't connect with your child. And that's because of the nature of all of those things: ABA, speech therapy, occupational therapy, going to school, all of those things. It's so important to have that connection. And if it's not there, you have to try something else, and you have to be willing to stand up and say, we need to try something else, because this is not working for him or her. And we need it to.
Yeah, for some reason we all feel like with individual therapy or with psychotherapy that the connection is extremely valuable, but we forget often when it's behavioral therapy that
Sure.
connection is just as important. And there are going to be times where hard conversations have to be had between family members and clinicians, and between the recipient of care. I'm sure that you want your sons growing up where they're going to advocate for themselves. Say, hey, this is not good. I don't like this. And for their voice to be equally as powerful as any advocate around them. And I think it's healthy. I think it's good conversations to have. And I'm glad that you put that out there. And I don't know that all parents have all the trust that they can do this without being penalized, without somebody looking down on them, without
Mhm.
losing a resource. But I'd say have the conversation. I think it's super important. And if it's a temporary setback, then it's a temporary setback.
Right.
But it's better for the long run. So where do you suggest that families go for additional information? And where do you also suggest people that are listening right now and like, you know what, I want to be a part of this. I want to know how to be able to get involved. Like, where can they start learning? Where can they start hearing the voices? Where can they start to get a better picture of what the autistic experience is from varieties of viewpoints?
Well, and I think we're lucky that we're in a time now where social media is just so prevalent, because you can find it anywhere, honestly. You can do Google searches, you can, search for Facebook groups, you can search even on LinkedIn. I'm in a couple parent groups, as well as the Autism Society and things like that, where you're just able to see those things. But I mean, social media just has a massive amount, and I think there's always going to be a little trial and error there too, to find, groups that are where you can see yourself fitting in, and that are truly accepting. But definitely try again. If it doesn't work the first time, find a different group. But I think a lot of resources, and it depends on your community too. We here in the area that I live in Michigan, we actually have an organization called KRESA, that is the Kalamazoo Regional Educational Service Agency, that you can always get information from outside of just schools. But I I I feel like I'm so lucky to have that and to be in this area, because they help parents navigate things like IEPs, and they're always in those meetings. So it's not just, not to say, not to sound negative, but not in a negative way, but it's not just the parent against the school,
Yeah.
like trying to fight those things out. I don't have to worry so much about that, because they're there and they advocate for my children. And
Mhm.
so that's a wonderful thing. But they have different things that they advertise as well, as far as support groups and those sensory friendly events and things that I was talking about as well.
I would imagine that's also a great place for somebody who's saying, I want to get my foot wet in this type of career and experience some of the families that would be impacted, and some of the children, some of the young adults. I want to be a part of something.
Sure.
And I would imagine whether it's the community resource center, the parent support groups, the parent centers, or anything that's out there, it's just they have volunteer opportunities. And
Sure.
and if you want to know, hey, is this something I feel like fits me? Why not? Like, why not try that and then find your path from there and start exploring careers if that's where it guides you. Um, well, Jessica, I appreciate all that you're doing, all the voice that you've developed. I mean, it sounds like at one point you were scared to have it, but I'm glad that voice is out there, because it's going to empower so many other people. So thank you for your courage, but and also thank you for coming onto the podcast today and sharing that experience.
Sure. Of course.
Thank you for listening to Autism Weekly. We hope you tune back in next week to learn more about autism in the real world. Autism Weekly is now found on all the major listening apps, including Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Amazon Music, and more. Subscribe to be notified when we post a new podcast. Autism Weekly is produced by ABS Kids. ABS Kids is proud to provide diagnostic assessments and ABA therapy to children with developmental delays like autism spectrum disorder. You can learn more about ABS Kids and the Autism Weekly podcast by visiting abskids.com. Thanks for tuning in. See you again next week.